is jazz. I mean, once you want to know about Afro-American music, you go to Monk.
One minute he's sort of playing and in a very uninhibited way, and then he's up, standing up, sort of grooving to the music in another world.
He didn't care about what people thought about him. He did things in his own way.
Monk did not understand that his music was difficult. He understood it. How come you didn't?
Monk is bad. He's just the man.
Thelonius Monk playing one of his most famous compositions, Round Midnight. At the time of this performance in 1966, it was a jazz classic. But the tune had been composed over 20 years before. It had taken that long for the public to accept Monk's style of composition and the way he played the piano.
Clearly, the piano was a very satisfying way of expressing his artistry. Monk, of course, was also a person who used the entire keyboard. Sometimes alarmingly so. You'd find him like he's the only piano player I can think of who would go and explore the very last right-hand key and see what sound he was going to get out of it. And unless the piano was in awfully good shape, you weren't going to get anything out of what was down there. It's hard to imagine Thelonious being anything other than a piano player.
Born in North Carolina in 1917, Monk showed an interest in the piano from the age of 4 and took piano lessons at 12. In the 1930s, he attended New York's Juilliard School of Music, but Monk rejected any classical training, developing his own attacking approach to the keyboard.
You can see the aspect of body, instrument, connection. It's not about, it's about, that kind of thing. It's really body-oriented,
He's just like, it's a whole different thing because his whole feet starts moving and his whole body is really into it. He gets this side turn thing happening. It's brilliant.
Also, one of the things is he plays flat fingers, because with flat fingers he's really playing the hand every time he plays. He's not playing the fingers like usually it's normal. So he played so he get that really heavy sound, percussive. So, and you could watch him either doing that, or with the feet, or with the body playing the notes. So you can tell that he's playing the body into every note. I can just feel it.
His music had to be hard-hitting. Monk played in New York, which in the early 1940s was experiencing a revolution in jazz. The Hangout was a club uptown in Harlem, opened in 1938. Minton's Playhouse.
We're now on location at one time was affectionately known by a lot of musicians as Minton's Playhouse, the temple of musical growth. I mean, a lot of musicians were working like the blue-collar gigs downtown. They would rush to get up here.
Downtown gigs were played for money. The musicians played Minton's for fun. By 1941 and up against the cream of New York's jazz players, Monk, still only 24 years old, was good enough to become Minton's house pianist. The competition between musicians was tough, even when they were just hanging out.
They might be, playing crap on the sidewalk, shooting crap, kicking it around, the music around, the debates on who was better than who on a certain instrument, who's the best drummer, the best bass player, and whatnot. I mean, it was just music, man. The music was the thing.
Different music was on the menu at Minton's. Minton's had an open bandstand policy. Anyone could come and play. With Monk and the house band, they could test their ideas on the audience, but it wasn't that easy. If the players were no good, the house band would freeze them out, attacking the roots of their music, the chord sequences.
Every tune that you can think of has what's called a chord sequence, which is, if you like, the building blocks underneath the actual melody. And what jazz musicians do is they take the chord sequence and make up their own melodies on top of it. So what the piano player is doing is outlining that chord sequence for the soloist.
Well, a chord is made up of its tones. I mean, you'll have the root, the third, the fifth, and the seventh. Then you start building voicings around that. So you'll say, okay, well, I'll play the root and the seventh in the left hand, and I'll play the third and the seventh in the right hand. And there you've got a typical jazz voicing. Jazz musicians experiment with all of these sounds and move it around, and that's how you develop your sort of harmonic language.
Chords were so heavily disguised by Monk that a weaker horn player might easily be lost, unable to play a solo.
They couldn't always tell what he was going to do. He was always come out with some, what about now? I'll play this chord now here. And the sax player go, whoa, what the hell was that, And that really develops into a concept. I think he was truly a complete innovator.
Not really. The way I did it last time, that steamer. Last time we had steak, I heated it the next night. You said, oh, that's a great idea. Yeah, that'll keep it running. You do know what I did.
Monk left
The
Minton's
big
in
pasta pot
1944, but kept experimenting with the concepts.
has an
testing
insert
anyone who
that
played
goes
with
on
it.
top. So you put a little bit of water and slice the meat up
To
and
say
lay it
that,
around the top part
Thelonius was
and let it
testing
steam for quite a while, and it gets
I
real
think
hot
the
and
test
keeps it
probably
moist.
came to see if they could actually play the tunes and be a part of the concept of the band.
When it's
because
done,
one of the typical ways
You
Monk
look at it
taught
and see if it's
his
hot.
music,
You're
or
not
taught
cooking it, you're
anybody
just
in his
heating it,
band
so when
playing
it's
the music
hot, it's
was
done.
by not giving them the music. So they would have
Wouldn't
to memorize it, they have to
near
learn
take
it by
that long.
ear.
I mean, you're just
So
heating it
there
up.
automatically you're being sort of put on the
You
spot.
just got to look at it. It
And
could be
there
5
you're
minutes.
creating a totally improvised situation. So say if you were thinking of a piece of music has
Watched me do
written
it, though,
notes
so
on
I
a
was
piece of
thinking you saw
paper.
it.
Well, music isn't that. You want to actually just hear the sound of the music and play the music and get to that straight away with no barrier in between. And that was, I think, Monk's thinking behind this.
But his music was not popular. Between 1944 and 1947, Monk worked in the bands of sax player Coleman Hawkins and trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie, but other work was scarce. Disaster struck in 1951. Monk was arrested and spent 2 nights in prison for possession of heroin. He lost his license to work, his cabaret card.
The cabaret card has become infamous in the jazz world, particularly after Thelonius Monk and Billie Holiday had their cards taken away from them. And once they lost their cards, they couldn't work in any place where liquor was sold, which meant the clubs, the cabarets, and even a lot of restaurants. I got one. I was down there in it must have been around 1959. I went down to headquarters, and there was no problem about it, and you got the card. By barring anybody from playing in cabarets in New York City, it's going to hurt you. New York City was the jazz capital of the world. New York City is the center of show business. New York City is where the press is. New York City is where the publicity is. So you want to be in the clubs. You want your name out in front on a sign. You want the reviews. And of course it hurt Monk not to be able to play in the clubs.
Actually, you were not totally barred from working. You could work what was known as a casual gig, which was no more than 3 days. So that usually meant you could work on the weekends. But the point is, there's a kind of a vicious circle involved there. Without the exposure that I think would have increased his popularity to begin with, Monk was not really in demand. He didn't even work many weekends because he wasn't very attractive to club owners.
Well, Thelonius Monk, number one, was one of the kinds of people that jazz is full of who wasn't paying attention to business. He was solely concerned with his music, what he was playing, and whether he was gathering an audience or not. I'm sure he was not happy to have played in obscurity for as long as he did. He just saw that with his music, that was what was going to happen. And it was a long time before he got the recognition he should have had earlier.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
For Monk, music was always more important than popularity. And throughout the 50s, he continued to carve his own path. Thelonius Monk grew up in the Black Gospel Church, where he played piano from the age of 10. Gospel music has given many black musicians a strong grounding.
Gospel music is many things. It's song of praise, it's a song of feeling, of sensual feeling, and of joy. The freedom of expressing yourself, not putting any limitation on the voice or the instrument.
At 17, Monk dropped out of high school to tour with a sanctified evangelist for 2 years. In church, the minister would fire up the congregation with a rhythmic structure called call and response.
The call and response comes from West Africa, where the griot, the storyteller, would be telling stories to the tribe. And as he would tell the story, they would make comments. In today's gospel church, when a Baptist or Pentecostal minister will say, yes, and Jesus was talking to the multitude. And they say, oh yeah, we know what you're talking about. He gave them all he could about what they could do about their lives. They say, oh yes, brother, we know.
Monk would take the call and response or question and answer and turn them into musical phrases. Making and adapting phrases or motifs was a trademark of Monk's compositions, like Blue Monk.
Repetition. Answer to that, question and answer. The same, repetition. Repetition. That's the question, now the answer. Now the question turns into an answer. Question now. Answer. Monk composition really, to me, exemplify what the music is about. It's about being intelligent and intellectual, but at the same time, that a melody that your mother and my grandmother or my kids or, children could sing. And he had that.
The way Monk used melodies made his music different. His methods were learned from the dance music that Monk played as a youngster at local rent parties. Rent parties were held by tenants who charged entrance to their apartments to pay their rent. The music they danced to was stride piano.
The music is steeped in rhythm, so obviously dancing in it is good. I mean, Monk always said that you can dance to his music. The rhythm of it, the beat, the groove, was very, very important to Monk, and definitely in the way that stride piano is played is a very danceable rhythm.
Stride piano provided the rhythm behind the dance craze of the 1920s, the Charleston. Stride was demanding to play. It used fast tempos and the piano's full range. The style got its name from the way the pianist's hands would stride up and down the piano.
Stride piano, first of all, is where you play the bass and the chord. Bass, chord, bass, chord. So you sort of like...
Stride players would take classical or popular melodies and add a syncopated beat.
2 and 4, 2 and 4, 2, 4, almost like a band marching.
Monk's melodies didn't flow. Instead, he cut them into phrases and cunningly played with their relationship to the beat, not placing, but displacing the rhythm.
Well, one thing that Monk did a lot was use a tool that we call rhythmic displacement, which means he takes a melody and puts it on a different beat. So, for instance, you get this kind of thing. It's basically the same phrase repeated 3 times, but coming at a different place in the bar. Without the rhythmic displacement, it would have actually sounded like this. Boring.
During the early 1950s, Monk was still held in low esteem, even after he regained his cabaret card. His record company, Prestige, made very few recordings of him, except as a sideman to popular musicians like Miles Davis. Company boss Bob Weinstock was happy to let Monk go for a bargain fee.
It was $127 and change that he wanted from Thelonius. I personally lent Thelonius the money, and we did have an agreement that if for any reason we didn't get together and he didn't come and work for us, and that was a personal loan, and he owed me the money. I don't know how much luck I would have had getting paid back. That's a moot point, because we did sign him as soon as he was out from under Prestige.
Over 6 years at Riverside Records, Orrin Keep News produced 12 albums with Monk. These got Monk noticed. And when a new club opened in New York called the 5 Spot, the owners were keen to book Monk and his up-and-coming sax player, John Coltrane.
I believe, as I say, exposure to Monk and the fact that more people were getting more of a chance to hear what he was doing, and perhaps just with the passage of time realized that it was very creative and not really that frightening. If you weren't easily frightened, you didn't have to be frightened of his music. Quite definitely the engagement, the roughly 6 months that they played at the 5 Spot that was the turning point.
Popularity meant that Monk made the cover of Time magazine in 1964, but success never changed him. He walked out of his recording contract with CBS 3 years later when it was suggested he gave an album of Beatle covers the Monk treatment. He stopped performing in 1976 and became a recluse until his death in 1982.
If there's one person about whom I can say unequivocally that this man never compromised, that this man never even thought of betraying or watering down his art, that man would be Thelonius Monk.
I saw Monk as being as a kid, you know, just like a brilliant, genius kid that never just stay being a kid with the purity of a kid, but the mind of a genius.